Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 29. The Youthful Son. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we left off with the Battle of Manzikert, one of the most important battles in Turkish history and indeed in human history. Following this battle, the gates of Anatolia were opened to the Turks, and the tribes began flooding onto the Anatolian plateau. From these bands of Turkmen, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum would be born, the first Turkish state in what is now the homeland of the Turks. But we are not going to be covering that today, or even in the next several episodes. Instead, we are going to stay focused on the history of the Great Seljuks. Like I said when I started this run of episodes on the history of the Seljuks, my plan is to cover the history of the Great Seljuk Empire up through the reign of Melik Shah, before then zooming in to focus on the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. And I have since decided to do a series of non-narrative episodes covering what the Great Seljuk Empire was actually like, covering the state, the army, religion and culture, the economy, and so on, which I'm going to do after we finish the reign of Melik Shah I, the last sultan to rule a united Seljuk Empire. So it's actually going to be a while before we pick back up with the Turks in Anatolia after Manzikert. Instead, today, we are going to continue the story of the Great Seljuks, and we're going to close out the story of Alp Arslan and properly introduce his son and successor, Melik Shah. And we will also introduce the man who, in many ways, would be the real ruler of the empire after the death of the heroic lion, the Persian Grand Vizier Nizam ul-Mulk. Now, Alp Arslan is today mostly remembered for Manzikert. It is seen as the crowning moment of his career, both in Turkey, where Manzikert is seen as the glorious beginning of the Turkish nation in Anatolia, and in the Christian West, where Manzikert is seen as the great catastrophe of the Roman Empire, from which all future catastrophes flow. But at the time, to Alp Arslan himself, this was really not the way he saw it. Anatolia as a whole was really just a sideshow to him. It was really nothing more than a release valve for the wild Turkmen and potentially rebellious princes of the House of Seljuk. He had no conception at all that it would become the homeland of the Turks, and that his name would one day be sung across it for his victory at Manzikert. Indeed, he would likely be shocked to learn just how much he is remembered for this one battle. A battle that he really didn't even want to fight against an enemy that he really didn't see as an enemy at a place he really didn't care that much about. Alp Arslan rode west in the first place to discipline the Nawakiya, the Turkmen tribes that he saw as a threat to his regime, and to bring into line the Shia heretics ruling Syria. In essence, to continue the work of his uncle Tuhrul, to expand the Seljuk state, keep the tribes in line, and be the defender of Sunni orthodoxy. His quarrel with the emperor of the Romans had only occurred because Emperor Romanos had allied with the Nawakiya, and after the victory in Syria, the Nawakiya had been forced to submit. It was in fact a minor spat with a ruler he had been on generally good terms with, and a spat that he always felt there was a diplomatic solution to. Alp Arslan was therefore totally willing to just cut a new deal with Constantinople and ride back east to continue what he saw as his real work. Instead, the Romans had refused his offer to make a new peace treaty and thus brought destruction down upon their own heads. Alp Arslan had then treated the emperor with all courtesy and respect after his victory, and now Alp Arslan hoped that Emperor Romanos would be able to win the civil war erupting in Byzantium after the catastrophe at Manzikert. He wanted to once again have an ally on the throne in Constantinople. So Manzikert was to Alp Arslan himself very much a sideshow. And with that sideshow now ended, he returned back to what he saw as his main task, namely, entrenching the power of the Seljuk state within the lands of Islam. Now, if you think back through the prior 3 episodes, one thing you'll notice is that Alp Arslan has ping-ponged back and forth across the Seljuk Empire throughout his career. He started from the east and rode west to claim the throne. Then he rode west to invade Georgia and Armenia, before riding east to put down a revolt in Khorasan and Balkh, before riding to Kirman to defeat his brother Kavurt. Then back west to the Caucasus again, then back east to Kirman to defeat Kavurt a second time, and then back to the west to Syria and finally to Manzikert. Indeed, he spent relatively little time in his capital at Esfahan. This was likely because the work of holding the empire together, as the institutions of the state were still being built, required the presence of the Sultan, and he constantly needed to both put down rebellions and reinforce his role as the ruler of the Turkmen by leading them to victory. Well now, having spent so long in the west, Alp Arslan prepared to ride back to the far east in yet another campaign to the edge of the empire. What would turn out to be his final campaign. And this campaign would be to cross the river Oxus, the Amu Darya, into Transoxiana, to wage war against the Karakhanids. To force the venerable and ancient House of Afrasiyab to submit to their former vassals, the young and upstart House of Seljuk. To understand the proximate cause of this invasion, we need to understand Alp Arslan's desire to continue to build out the institutions of the Seljuk state and to entrench the power and legitimacy of his young dynasty. We should never forget that the House of Seljuk had come to power shockingly quickly. The Battle of Dandan Khan and the Battle of Manzikert were only 31 years apart. In other words, it had only been a couple of decades since the Seljuks had been nothing but a band of wild Oghuz refugees fleeing into Khorasan. And now here they were, the rulers of virtually the whole Muslim world east of Egypt. As we have discussed, this was accompanied by Tughro and Alp Arslan beginning to build a real state in the Perso-Islamic tradition. Now, like I said, I'm going to spend a whole non-narrative episode discussing in detail this state-building project and the intricacies of the Seljuk government. But for now, you should know that this project had been rapidly advancing during the reign of Alp Arslan under the leadership of his immensely talented and powerful Grand Vizier, Nizam ul-Mulk. We see continued evidence of increasing formalization of the Seljuk state during his reign, the expansion and growing sophistication of the court and the state's bureaucracy. This was no longer a confederation of wild tribesmen. Indeed, in some ways, it was no longer really a steppe state at all, but a form of a hybrid state, a fusion of a steppe confederation and a Perso-Islamic state. And as part of this state-building project led by Nizam ul-Mulk, Alp Arslan also sought to tie the House of Seljuk itself into the great, existing powerful lineages of the day. Tughro had of course begun this by forcing the Caliph al-Qayyim to marry his niece, who incidentally was Alp Arslan's sister, and by forcing the Caliph's daughter to marry him himself, much to her and her father's distaste. These marriages were particularly important to the Seljuks because of the obscure origin of the dynasty. The founder, Seljuk, had been merely a leader of a minor and obscure clan of Turks, the Kunuk tribe, a tribe greatly powerful within the weak and disorganized Oghuz tribal confederation, but unheard of outside of the parochial world of that dead state. The Seljuks could not trace their lineage back to the Ashina clan or the other great leaders of the Turks. They were, in essence, nobodies. It's just that they happened to be nobodies who had happened to conquer the world. So marriages into the grander lineages, like the Abbasid dynasty, were crucial to the Seljuks, not just to present themselves as inheritors of the existing political system, but to legitimize the dynasty itself. In short, to marry into blue blood, so that their children would be heirs to great lineages. And because the act of marriage itself legitimized the Seljuk dynasty by demonstrating that the great and ancient houses of the day recognized the House of Seljuk as an equal. And so Alp Arslan had set to work marrying his family members into these great houses. In 1071, while staying in Nishapur shortly after Manzikert, Alp Arslan had arranged to have his daughter marry the caliph's heir. Alp Arslan seems to have demanded that the caliph both recognize Melik Shah as the heir to the Seljuk throne, which yet again demonstrates his desire to solve the problem created by the messy succession rules of the Turkish political system, and to send his son as a bridegroom for his daughter. This the caliph did, with his son coming to the Seljuk court carrying robes of honor for both Alp Arslan and Melik Shah, and then formally requesting that Alp Arslan allow him to marry his daughter. According to Ibn al-Athir, the contract for marriage was signed near Nishapur in 1072, with Nizam ul-Mulk acting as proxy for Alp Arslan. But in addition to marrying his daughter into the Abbasid lineage, Alp Arslan was keen to marry his family into the Karakhanid dynasty, the House of Afrasiab, the blue bloods of the steppe world. In 1064, Alp Arslan had married his chosen successor Melik Shah, his son, into the Karakhanid house when the boy was still only 9. Melik Shah was wed to Terken Khatun, who was the daughter of Tamgach Khan Ibrahim, the western Khan of the Karakhanids. Then Alp Arslan married his daughter to Tamgach Ibrahim Khan's son, Shams al-Mulk Nasir Khan, after he succeeded his father to the throne of the House of Afrasiab in 1068. This made Alp Arslan technically the Khan's father-in-law, and made Melik Shah the son-in-law of the Khan's dead father, so very complicated. And this complicated relationship between the Seljuks and the Karakhanids was a bit sensitive. In some ways, the stunning conquests of the Seljuks and their proclamation by the caliphs to be the Shah and Shah and the kings of East and West, their relationship with the Abbasid caliphs made them the senior party from a Perso-Islamic perspective. But on the other hand, the Karakhanids boasted a far more impressive steppe lineage, claiming for themselves the title Khan, a link that stretched all the way back to the first and second Göktürk Khanates before the coming of Islam. The Seljuks would never claim this title, recognizing that their obscure lineage in the steppe world simply could not warrant it. No doubt, this was part of the reason that Tuhrul and Alp Arslan were so enamored with the Perso-Islamic tradition. By tying themselves to the ancient, sedentary civilization of Iran and the grand Islamic religious tradition stretching back to the Messenger, they were in essence legitimizing themselves in a way that their lowly origins would never warrant on the steppe world that they had come from. Even if they could never be Khans, by playing Shah, they were in essence leapfrogging their social betters. But for their part, no doubt, the Karakhanids remembered that the Seljuks had begun as a minor vassal of the House of Afrasiab. They remembered the obscure and lowly origins of the House of Seljuk. So as the great Seljuk Empire rapidly expanded, as it conquered the world, tensions inevitably grew between the two great Turkish states. Things boiled over in 1071, as the heroic lion was focused on the west and defeating the Byzantines at Manzikert. While the western Karakhanid Khan, Nasir Khan, was out on campaign on the steppes, one of Alp Arslan's sons, Ayaz, who was the governor of Tokharistan and had been left in charge of the east as his father took over the central state, launched an invasion across the Amu Darya, the river Oxus, to attack Samarkand and Bukhara. As always, the Great River was the traditional border between Central Asia and Khorasan, and yet again, as we have seen like 100 times so far in this podcast, an army from the south was crossing to assault Transoxiana. Now we don't know if Alp Arslan ordered this attack, but it seems unlikely. As we will discuss in our non-narrative episodes, the Seljuk state was actually quite decentralized in practice, and the various princes and emirs had their own armies that they could command as they saw fit. Upon hearing the news that Ayaz was besieging his capital, Nasir Khan rode back to Samarkand in a fury and defeated Ayaz outside the walls of the great city. Nasir Khan then enslaved a portion of the Seljuk troops and killed the others, as Ayaz fled back to Khorasan. Beyond furious, Nasser Khan then made a critical blunder. He accused his wife, Alp Arslan's daughter, of helping her brother by spying on behalf of the Seljuks and even inciting Ayaz to invade Transoxiana. He therefore beat her to death. And needless to say, beating the daughter of the most powerful man in the world to death is a very, very bad idea. Alp Arslan heard the news of his daughter's death in early 1072. He was, of course, extremely distraught and absolutely livid, and he immediately began planning for vengeance. So he summoned Melik Shah and Nizam ul-Mulk to join him and mustered a large army in Iran. Alp Arslan then began marching east in September 1072, determined to avenge his daughter and bring Nasser Khan to justice. Indeed, to force the House of Afrasiyab to recognize the sovereignty of the House of Seljuk. Alp Arslan and his army crossed the Amu Darya and made for the city of Samarkand. According to Ibn al-Athir, the army was so vast that it took 20 days to cross the river. But as they marched closer to Samarkand, Alp Arslan besieged a strong fortress on the road to Samarkand named Hana, sometimes rendered as Berzem. Likely, he felt the need to secure the retreat of the army and not leave any significant military force to his rear. We don't have details of the siege, but ultimately the fortress capitulated. On the 21st of November, 1072, the commander of the fortress was brought before Alp Arslan. He was bound, with his hands tied, and awaited his sentence, expecting, of course, to be killed. He then berated Alp Arslan that he was going to be executed while bound, which was a great mark of disrespect to a noble such as him. The fortress commander reportedly screamed in anger at Alp Arslan, saying, "Should such a man as me be killed in such a way?" According to almost all historians, including Ibn al-Athir, taking umbrage at this remark, Alp Arslan then ordered his men to unbind the commander. The heroic lion then took out his bow, notched an arrow, pulled back the bowstring, and fired straight at the commander. But shockingly, he missed. As Alp Arslan fumbled for another arrow, the commander, now unbound, sprang forward. Pulling two concealed knives out of his clothing, he then fell upon Alp Arslan, stabbing him deeply. Alp Arslan stumbled back, mortally wounded. The heroic lion was then dragged out and taken to another tent, while his retainers fell upon the assassin, beating him to death before tearing him limb from limb. Alp Arslan was now dying. As he lay in the tent surveying his wounds, he knew that there was no way he could survive this. His thoughts immediately turned to the succession. For years, he had been cultivating his son Melik Shah as his heir. He had forced the caliph to recognize him. He had forced the emirs to recognize him. He had given him top military command so that he would gain the necessary experience. He had put him at the head of raiding parties to gain the loyalty of the wild Turkmen tribes. And now, the time had come for the son to succeed the father. But Alp Arslan knew that while he could do his very best to set up his son as an heir, the reality was that the Turkish political system did not recognize this. The throne would go to whatever member of the House of Seljuk could gain it. It would go to the strongest. Now Alp Arslan had tried to change this system, to ditch the Turkish system of clan sovereignty for the Perso-Islamic system of inheritance. And perhaps that might have worked if Alp Arslan had lived longer, and if his son had been older at the time of his death. Who knows? Maybe Melik Shah would have been old enough, and the state-building project would have been so advanced that civil war could have been avoided. But Melik Shah was merely 17 years old, and Alp Arslan's reign had lasted less than a decade, so that just wasn't going to happen. And there were, of course, other claimants. There were other sons of Alp Arslan, including Ayaz, who had started this whole mess by invading across the river. There was Suleiman, the son of Kutalmish, who was at this very moment invading Anatolia, as we will discuss in great detail in later episodes. There were the Seljuk princes who had led the Nawakiya in Syria. And most importantly, there was Kavurt, the brother of Alp Arslan, who had attempted to seize the throne himself after the death of the great Tukhrul. Kavurt, who had rebelled twice against his brother and now ruled as the governor of Kirman in southeastern Iran. Kavurt, who had already fought the Seljuk court to a draw and was wildly popular among the Turkmen tribes. If there was anyone who was not going to accept the accession of Melik Shah, it was Kavurt. Still, Alp Arslan in his last days tried to give his son whatever advantage he could in the now inevitable and fast-approaching civil war. As he lay dying, Alp Arslan spent his final days with Melik Shah and Nizam ul-Mulk, doing all he could with his dying breath to ensure that the army and the capable and talented Nizam ul-Mulk would stand by his young son. Matthew of Edessa reports, feeling himself in a dire situation, the Sultan summoned his commanders and Nizam ul-Mulk to his side. The Sultan presented his son, Melik Shah I, the father of just one boy at this point, to them, and said, "I'm dying from the effects of my wounds. My son is your ruler and sits on my throne." Alp Arslan's health continued to weaken as he succumbed to his wounds. He died 3 days after the stabbing, on November 24th, 1072. He was 40 years old. According to Ibn al-Athir, before he died, he confessed, "I said to myself, I am the master of the world, and no one can stand against me. Now God has undone me through the least of his creatures. I beg forgiveness of God, and ask him to pardon that thought." Thus passed Alp Arslan, the heroic lion. Alp Arslan is one of the most important guys in Turkish history. Ibn al-Athir writes, "He was generous, just, and wise, and never listened to malicious reports. The lands he ruled were very extensive. The world was subject to him. Rightly, he was addressed as the Sultan of the world." Alp Arslan kept the young Seljuk Empire together after the death of his uncle, seeing off revolts in both east and west, and expanded the great Seljuk Empire into Syria and down into the Levant, creeping slowly towards Fatimid Egypt, the only state in the Islamic world that could even deign to call itself a rival to the House of Seljuk. Personally, Alp Arslan was pious and is widely remembered as a benevolent ruler, though there is some grumbling in the sources about arbitrary officials and the occasional rampages of the Turkmen. As we will discuss in more detail in our non-narrative episodes on the Seljuk state, he continued his uncle's project of state building. Under his reign, the Seljuk state continued to cook. Indeed, it began to transform into a proper Persian-style empire. It was Alp Arslan who brought Nizam ul-Mulk into government, whose reforms to the state, as we will come to see, will reach their fruition during the reign of Melik Shah. But above all, despite his own likely feelings about the matter, Alp Arslan is important for Manzikert, the great battle that opened Anatolia to his people, that gave them their homeland. Though he would not live to see the consequences of that battle, the great battle that he himself did not want to fight, and indeed, he could never have even imagined those consequences, there is a reason that Alp Arslan's name will be forever linked to Manzikert. He was, in a sense, the inadvertent founder of the Turkish nation in Anatolia. And that is quite a legacy to essentially stumble into. So now, Alp Arslan lies dead in Transoxiana, and his son Melik Shah has been named to be the Sultan. But of course, he knew he would have to fight to keep the throne. Now, Melik Shah has popped in and out of our story before, but I didn't really properly introduce him. So here goes. Here's the story of the last man to rule the united Great Seljuk Empire. Melik Shah was born in 1055, and he was not the eldest of Alp Arslan's sons. Likely he was preceded by Ayaz, Ilyas, and potentially other male children, but he quickly became his father's favorite. As we have discussed, Alp Arslan took him with him on campaigns several times, including in Iran, the Caucasus, and Syria. He had even given him command of armies when he was a teenager, at first under the watchful eye of the skilled Nizam ul-Mulk. And Alp Arslan was desperate to make sure that Melik Shah would succeed him. As we have discussed over and over again, he attempted to force the whole world to recognize his young son as his heir. According to the sources, Melik Shah was in appearance tall, fair-skinned, and a little bit chubby. Several sources mention his piety and his modesty. He was, by all accounts, exceptionally intelligent, fluent in both Arabic and Persian, and with a keen interest in literature, philosophy, science, and architecture. A far cry from the days when the Seljuk Sultan was an illiterate barbarian and spoke neither Persian nor Arabic. And it would be under Melik Shah that the great Seljuk Empire would reach the zenith of its power, prosperity, influence, and might. But as we will come to see, Melik Shah would in some ways be overshadowed by his powerful Grand Vizier, Nizam ul-Mulk, even unto the tragic end of his life, which also ended the glory days of the united Great Seljuk Empire. But we'll get to that eventually. For now, Melik Shah is sitting in Transoxiana mourning the death of his father, but he knew he had to act quickly. Already, the news of the death of the heroic lion was spreading throughout the empire. There was no question of continuing the campaign against the Karakhanids. That would have to wait. He urgently needed to return to the empire itself to secure his claim to the throne. In order to do that, Melik Shah really needed this great army now in Transoxiana to support him. Remember, Alp Arslan had assembled a truly massive army to invade the Karakhanid Khanate. Well now, if Melik Shah could gain their loyalty, that huge army could instead be used to defeat his inevitable rivals for the throne. And Nizam ul-Mulk was critical to assuring the loyalty of the army. Now, like Melik Shah, Nizam ul-Mulk has been kicking around our story already, and as I said, Nizam ul-Mulk has already been the most powerful man in the state after Alp Arslan. But under Melik Shah, Nizam ul-Mulk will become in essence the co-ruler of the state. It's not too much to say that the rule of the Great Seljuk Empire under Melik Shah will in essence be a partnership between the two men, with the Sultan as the junior partner. So I decided that instead of introducing him formally earlier, I would wait until now, the moment that he really steps into the driver's seat. Nizam ul-Mulk was a Persian born in the city of Tus in Khorasan in the year 1018. He was therefore about 37 years older than Melik Shah and 54 years old when Alp Arslan died. Nizam ul-Mulk had been born into a family of Dekhans, that is, Iranian land-owning nobility. His father had been a financial officer in the Ghaznavid court, and Nizam ul-Mulk had been sent to study Islamic law at a young age. Sometime in his teens, he entered into the service of the Ghaznavids himself, serving as a clerk to a financial official. After the Seljuks defeated the Ghaznavids at the Battle of Dandan-Khan in 1040, when he was merely 22 years old, Nizam ul-Mulk fled to Ghazna with the rest of the court. But after a couple of years, as the Seljuks conquered his homeland in Khorasan and began to actually build a state, he left the Ghaznavids to join up with the Seljuks. As Tughral conquered Iran and Iraq and became the king of East and West, the young Nizam ul-Mulk took up employment with a man named Abu Ali ibn Shazan, a vizier serving the eastern Seljuk court ruled by Chahri in Balkh. Nizam ul-Mulk's intelligence and skills were quickly recognized. Abu Ali came to serve as the Grand Vizier of Chahri, and as he aged, more and more of his workload was taken up by his protege, Nizam ul-Mulk. Abu Ali continued in his post after the death of Chahri, and when the end came for Abu Ali himself, he recognized to the new Sultan Alp Arslan that Nizam ul-Mulk should succeed him as Grand Vizier. Thus Nizam ul-Mulk came to serve as the Grand Vizier to Alp Arslan, a prince about 15 years younger than himself, and when Alp Arslan shortly thereafter succeeded Tuhrul, he brought Nizam ul-Mulk to the summit of power with him. But though the two men greatly respected each other and had a strong professional relationship that lasted for over a decade, according to Nizam ul-Mulk himself, his relationship with the heroic lion was always somewhat frosty. It seems that while Alp Arslan recognized Nizam ul-Mulk's talents and recognized how much he needed this wily Persian, he never really totally trusted him. Nizam ul-Mulk had a true genius for administration and for organization, which he quickly deployed during Alp Arslan's reign. As the heroic lion rode back and forth across the empire, in Esfahan and Rey, a sophisticated and powerful bureaucracy came into existence. Under Alp Arslan, Nizam ul-Mulk oversaw the increasingly powerful and sophisticated institutions of the state, continually strengthening them, and thus also strengthening himself. As we will discuss in a later non-narrative episode, it was under Nizam ul-Mulk's watch that the institutions of the Seljuk state came into their own. And as we have already seen, he was not only critical to Alp Arslan's state-building project, but was even a powerful military commander who led armies under the heroic lion. Crucially, Nizam ul-Mulk was definitively on the side of cooking the barbarians. He himself was an educated Persian, and he looked with disdain on the Turkish political traditions as barbaric, and he always tried to limit their presence and their importance to the state. Nizam ul-Mulk was a key driving force behind the Seljuk state-building project, and he was determined to build a Perso-Islamic state. If we go back to the old ideological division of steppe states, the modernizer-traditionalist divide, the divide between those who want to stay raw and keep the steppe life, and those who want to become cooked, as the Chinese would have said, Nizam ul-Mulk was firmly on the modernizer-cooker side. And this is not surprising because he himself was Persian, not Turkish, and was exactly the sort of educated courtier who would have had no place on the steppe world. Indeed, in the Chinese framework, he would have seen himself as the master chef of the barbarians, the civilized, sedentary man doing the cooking. And to such a person, Melik Shah was the perfect candidate. The two men knew each other very well, and likely Nizam ul-Mulk had been deeply involved in the young prince's education. He knew Melik Shah to be an intelligent young man, versed in Arabic and Persian culture, who loved literature and art and science. Far better than the rougher, more barbaric Turks who could potentially succeed Alp Arslan. Perhaps most importantly, a man so young would be heavily reliant on the existing state structures controlled by the Grand Vizier. That is, he would be heavily reliant on Nizam ul-Mulk. And Melik Shah had been with his father the whole time, with the central state authority. His succession, indeed his existence, was part of the state-building project in a sense. He was not an outsider. If another claimant won, that claimant would surely want to clean house, bring in their own people. From a purely cynical perspective, Melik Shah was the only choice for Nizam ul-Mulk. Thus Nizam ul-Mulk ensured that the army in Transoxiana and its commanders stayed loyal. In the words of Ibn al-Athir, after the Sultan Alp Arslan had been wounded, he named his son Melik Shah, who was with him at the time, as his successor, and ordered the army to swear allegiance to him, which they all did. The person who managed all of this was Nizam ul-Mulk. The army thus declared for Melik Shah, who gathered up his dead father's body and began marching back towards the Seljuk domains. According to most historians, when he crossed into Nishapur, he traveled to the city of Merv. There he laid Alp Arslan to rest in the same tomb that held the remains of his father Chari, the brother of the great Tuhrul, and the man who had defeated the Ghaznavids at Dandan to establish the Seljuk state. From there, the army moved on to Nishapur. Once there, Nizam ul-Mulk sent messengers off to Baghdad, ordering that the khutbah be read in the name of the Caliph and the new Sultan Melik Shah. He also sent messengers off to the various governors throughout the empire, ordering them to do the same. But Melik Shah and Nizam ul-Mulk decided to sweeten the deal, to try to convince the various Seljuk princes governing various provinces to accept the accession of Melik Shah. Allegedly, on the deathbed advice of Alp Arslan, Ayaz was confirmed in Tokharistan and given a bonus of 500,000 gold dinars. And perhaps most important of all, Kavurt, the lord of Kirman, the Seljuk prince who had rebelled against Alp Arslan twice before, was to be confirmed in Kirman and in Fars, and he was to be given not just a large sum of money, but Alp Arslan's widow as a bride. This custom, of widows being married to surviving princes, was long standing in the Turkish political system. Indeed, Tuhrol had married a widow of his brother Chahri himself. This was a mark of great honor, and it was likely intended to be a sign that after Melik Shah, Kavurt would be accepted as the second prince of the empire. But Kavurt, of course, was not going to accept this. When he heard of the death of his brother Alp Arslan, Kavurt immediately began gathering up an army to march towards Rey, determined to seize the throne. Reportedly, he wrote to Melik Shah saying, "I am the eldest brother, and you are a youthful son. I have the greater right to my brother Alp Arslan's inheritance." Melik Shah reportedly responded by saying that a brother does not inherit when a son lives, which is of course the Persian and not the Turkish understanding. When they heard reports that Kavurt was marching north, Melik Shah and Nizam ul-Mulk gathered up their forces and marched to Rey themselves. And as had happened 8 years earlier, Kavurt was beaten to the city. Thus Melik Shah and his uncle Kavurt were on the path to civil war. Both sides worked furiously to augment their forces and get the troops over to their side. But while Melik Shah was able to hold on to a large part of the army that had been assembled to invade Transoxiana, Kavurt was far more popular among the tribes. There are also hints in the sources that Kavurt was even able to induce defections among some of the Turkmen in the great army of Transoxiana that Melik Shah had inherited. And I think we need to see this as part of the ongoing tension between the cooked Seljuk court and the raw Turkmen nomads. Melik Shah was a cooked Turk, really the most cooked Turk we've seen so far. A man who loved poetry and literature, who was at home in the great palaces of the Muslim world in which he had in fact been born and raised. Indeed, this was one of the reasons that Nizam ul-Mulk had been so willing to advance his claim. Kavurt, however, was more of a traditionalist. He was far older than Melik Shah, likely having been born to Chahri sometime in the 1040s. That means he was born shortly after the Battle of Dandan Khan, as the Seljuks were still emerging as a power and still very much a steppe confederation. In his early life at least, Kavurt was probably raised in something approximating the steppe life. Even in his wars with Alp Arslan, Kavurt had been the favorite of the wilder Turkmen nomads. Naturally, they flocked to the man who promised a return to the old ways, not to this youthful prince, born and raised in palaces, and the wily Persian Grand Vizier who had spent the better part of a decade building a state that day by day encroached on what they saw as their traditional rights and practices. Even the nature of their claims to the throne highlight this modernist traditionalist divide. Melik Shah was claiming the throne by virtue of being named as an heir by his father, that is, a claim based in the Perso-Islamic tradition, in which a recognized heir had the right to succeed. Kavurt was claiming the throne under the traditional rules of the Turkish political system, that the state was the collective property of the ruling clan as a whole, and the throne went to the strongest. So as the tribes flocked to Kavurt, Melik Shah and Nizam ul-Mulk looked around for a way to further augment their troops. They had, of course, the core of the army that had been brought to Transoxiana, which was primarily composed of the wild Turkmen, of course. But they also had relatively large contingents of Turkish slave soldiers, Turkish Mamelukes. Now, like I said, I'm going to discuss in detail in a coming non-narrative episode the Seljuk army and the reforms to it that were pioneered by Nizam ul-Mulk. But for now, it is important to know that ever since Tughrul's conquest of Baghdad, the Seljuk court had been recruiting a corps of Turkish Mameluke troops. Unlike the wild Turkmen, who were somewhat uncontrollable, these Turkish slave soldiers were paid to fight, and were theoretically totally loyal to the Sultan. Indeed, the creation of a more loyal army, an army designed along the traditional models of the Perso-Islamic state structure, was part and parcel of the state-building project pioneered by Nizam ul-Mulk. The use of Turkish Mamelukes increased under the reign of Alp Arslan, and the expansion seems to have been massive. Nizam ul-Mulk himself writes that during Melik Shah's reign, there were nearly 400,000 Turkish Mamelukes in the Seljuk armies, while Ibn al-Athir tells us that Tughrul had merely 2,000 to 4,000 slave soldiers. That implies that during the reign of Alp Arslan, the expansion must have been dramatic. Though we can't nail down actual numbers for Alp Arslan's reign, I think we should imagine that there would have been a decent number of them in the service of the heroic lion at the time of his death. And Nizam ul-Mulk was able to secure the loyalty of these Turkish slave soldiers to Melik Shah. Additionally, Nizam ul-Mulk and Melik Shah drew on the support of Arab and Kurdish troops. Again, this was something that began during Tughrul's reign, the Seljuk court calling upon local Arab and Kurdish and Persian emirs to fight. These troops provided a useful complement to the nomadic horse archers that formed the core of the Seljuk armies, with the added benefit that they made the court less reliant on the wild tribesmen, and therefore, as with the use of Turkish slave soldiers, the use of these troops was deeply resented by the tribes. This, of course, made the Mamelukes and the Arab and Kurdish emirs natural allies of Melik Shah and Nizam ul-Mulk in the coming war with Kavurt. The two armies finally met in battle outside Hamadan in April 1073. Kavurt's popularity among the tribes seems, at first, to have given him the upper hand. Ibn al-Athir writes, "The army inclined to Kavurt, and when the left wing of Kavurt charged Melik Shah's right, they put it to flight." As his right wing collapsed, Melik Shah rallied his Arab and Kurdish emirs, who launched an assault from the left wing of Melik Shah's army against the right wing of Kavurt's. And somewhat surprisingly, this charge seems to have done the trick. Kavurt's army was defeated and began to rout. Melik Shah then ordered a full charge, and Kavurt's army was destroyed. Melik Shah had thus, in one battle, won the war for succession to his father. Kavurt himself fled the battlefield, hiding out in a small village nearby. A local peasant soon alerted Melik Shah to his presence, and Kavurt was brought before the Sultan and Nizam ul-Mulk. Melik Shah seems to have wanted to pardon his uncle. Indeed, this was something of a tradition in Seljuk history. Family members who rebelled were more often than not forgiven, and even left in their positions. It was only when things were truly existential that they would be executed for trying to gain the throne. Think, for example, of Tughrul forgiving Ibrahim Yanal the first time he revolted, and only executing him after his later revolt almost brought down the empire. Or think of how many times Alp Arslan had forgiven Kavurt before. This forgiving of members of the royal house for rebellion seems to have been tied to the Seljuk concept of clan sovereignty, the Turkish political tradition's notion that the state was the collective property of the ruling clan as a whole, and we do see instances of this practice in other Turkish states. And so Kavurt, for his part, begged for his life, and fittingly, he couched it in the traditional practices of the Turks. Sibt ibn al-Jawzi relates that he said, "Do not destroy this house by killing me and listening to the bureaucrats," meaning Nizam ul-Mulk, "as to what to do with me. Do with me what is fitting for the Turks, and I will give you the like of what you lost when your father died. I will go to Syria and Egypt, and I shall surrender my whole land to you." Even here, as he surrendered to Melik Shah, we can see Kavurt's hatred of the bureaucrats of Nizam ul-Mulk and his state institutions, the steppe leader's attachment to the Turkish traditions, even an inkling of the resentment and fury felt by many of the Turkmen towards this new Persian-style state and the policies and reforms of Nizam ul-Mulk. The tensions between the court and the tribes that have informed so much of Seljuk history. But Nizam ul-Mulk simply wasn't having it. No doubt he felt that Kavurt was a threat, and he thought that so early in the reign of the Sultan, such a powerful claimant to the throne could not be left alive. But Nizam ul-Mulk had other motivations. In his ongoing quest to cook the Turks, to transform the state into a proper Persian-style empire and sideline the wild tribes that he detested, he had of course seen the Seljuk princes as an obstacle. They were ruling their own mini-fiefs under the sultans, running their own shows, without listening to the court in Esfahan. And so to secure the power of the court, really his own power, Nizam ul-Mulk wanted to cut down the Seljuk aristocracy. Literally. So he ordered that Kavurt be executed and that his sons be blinded. And Kavurt would not be the first Seljuk aristocrat who would fall on the orders of Nizam ul-Mulk. But the largely Turkmen army, upon hearing of the execution of Kavurt and his sons, was outraged. They came before Melik Shah in Nizam ul-Mulk, cursing both the new sultan and his hated Persian Grand Vizier to their faces. According to Sibt ibn al-Jawzi, they said, "This is not what Alp Arslan bequeathed. According to his will, Kavurt Bey was to receive Kirman and Fars." And then, the army began to make menacing noises about what should be done with this young sultan, who had trampled over the traditions of the Turks by killing his uncle. Though it is a bit unclear from the sources, it seems that a low-scale mutiny began, with the wild Turkmen both threatening the young sultan and rampaging around the countryside, looting in their anger and fury. And it was here that Nizam ul-Mulk stepped in both to save the young sultan and to cement his own control over the state. It was here, as the new regime was establishing itself, that Nizam ul-Mulk came to essentially take it over. Reportedly, as the young Melik Shah was terrified of the Turkmen, fearing that they wanted to murder him for the execution of Kavurt, and as they rampaged through the countryside, Nizam ul-Mulk came to him and asked, "Do you want to manage this affair, or shall I?" Meekly, Melik Shah delegated the authority to Nizam ul-Mulk to resolve the situation. Nizam ul-Mulk thereupon strode out in front of the angry and almost mutinous Turkmen and essentially bought them off with Iqta land grants and bonuses of hard cash. The Turkmen were placated, and the danger passed. But in the act of abdicating this authority to Nizam ul-Mulk in the establishment of his regime and in his claiming the throne, Melik Shah in essence abdicated a large measure of his power as sultan to the canny old Grand Vizier. Now, Ibn al-Athir, who like most authors is very, very pro-Nizam ul-Mulk, passes over the specifics of the incident in a way to make Nizam ul-Mulk look good. But even he records that after the battle, the army of Melik Shah acted without restraint and laid their hands on the property of his subjects, claiming that it is no one but Nizam ul-Mulk who is preventing the Sultan from giving us money. The people were severely afflicted. Nizam ul-Mulk brought this to the attention of the Sultan and explained to him the weakness, the destruction of the country, and the loss of authority that such conduct would entail. Melik Shah replied, "Act in this, as seems to you most expedient." Nizam ul-Mulk replied, "I cannot act without your authorization." "I hand over to you all affairs, great and small," said the Sultan. "You are my father." He swore an oath to this, and gave him a fief in addition to what he already had, which included Tus, Nizam ul-Mulk's home city. He gave him robes of honor and many titles, including Ata Bey, which means Father Emir. Thus, Melik Shah, the youthful son of Alp Arslan, became the Sultan of the great Seljuk Empire. But a sultan ruling as the junior partner to the great and powerful Grand Vizier, Nizam ul-Mulk. The cunning Persian courtier had, in effect, seized control of the state. But this would not be the end of the tensions between the court and the tribes, and it also turns out that Nizam ul-Mulk's seizure of power would not be entirely permanent. So next time, we will discuss the beginning of the reign of Melik Shah and the effective rule of Nizam ul-Mulk, the period of Seljuk history that historians often call al-Dawla al-Nizamiya, meaning the state of the Nizam.